My future daughter-in-law had a habit of touching things in my house that didn't belong to her. Not stealing, just touching. Running her fingertips along the edge of the walnut sideboard my wife and I bought in '78, lifting the silver candlesticks an inch off the mantel and setting them back down, tilting her head at the small hopper sketch I keep in the hallway like she was trying to read its weight in dollars. I noticed it the third time she came over for dinner. My son Caleb didn't notice anything. He looked at her the way men look at women who've made them feel chosen for the first time in their lives. And I understood that look because I'd worn it myself once, 41 years earlier, when his mother walked into a coffee shop in Burlington and decided I was worth her time. The difference was that his mother had loved him. This one, Renata, was measuring him. I'm 73 years old. I retired from the federal bench 11 years ago, and before that I spent 31 years on it. And before that I was a prosecutor in Vermont and then in New York. And before that, I was a kid from a paper mill town in New Hampshire whose father told him exactly twice in his life that he was proud of him. I tell you this not because it matters to the story, but because I want you to understand that I have spent my entire adult life watching people lie. Defendants, witnesses, lawyers, cops, senators twice. I know what a lie looks like when it sits down to dinner. Renata's lies were beautiful. She laughed at the right time, asked questions about my late wife with an expression that mimicked tenderness almost perfectly, complimented the lamb without overdoing it. She was 31, a hospital administrator at one of the big systems in Boston, and she carried herself the way people who've decided to be impressive carry themselves, every gesture a little too rehearsed, every silence a little too deliberate. Caleb was 34, a structural engineer, gentle to a fault, the kind of man who apologizes when other people bump into him on the subway. He brought her up to the house in Stowe for the first time on a Sunday in October. The leaves were past peak but still holding on in patches, that bronze look they get before the wind takes them. She walked through my front door, took one slow look around the living room, and I watched her eyes do the same thing. An appraiser's eyes do when they walk into an estate sale. Catalog, catalog, catalog. Skip, catalog. She caught me watching. Smiled. Said, "Caleb told me you have wonderful taste, but he didn't prepare me." I said thank you. I poured her a glass of the Oregon Pinot Caleb likes. I shook her hand a second time at the door when she left, and I told my son, after she was in the passenger seat and couldn't hear, that I was glad to have met her. He kissed me on the cheek the way he's done since he was 9 years old, and I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long time, looking at the spot on the sideboard where her fingers had been. I called my old law clerk, Felicia, the next morning. She runs a small investigations firm in Manhattan now, mostly white-collar, some matrimonial. I gave her Renata's full name and date of birth and the name of the hospital system she claimed to work for. And I told her I wasn't in a hurry, but I wanted to be thorough. Felicia called me back 9 days later. Renata Volkov, 31, born in Tashkent, came to the U.S. with her mother at 14, naturalized at 20. The hospital administrator job was real. The salary was real. What was also real, and what Felicia took her time saying, was that Renata had been engaged twice before. The first time to a 46-year-old commercial real estate developer in Providence, who had broken it off after his accountant flagged that someone had been quietly opening lines of credit in his name. No charges filed. The man had paid Renata roughly $200,000 to walk away and sign an NDA. The second time to a 51-year-old cardiologist in Hartford. Same pattern. Different settlement. Different NDA. Caleb didn't have that kind of money. Caleb had a 401k, a condo in the South End he was still paying down, and a Subaru. What Caleb had was me. What Caleb had was the trust his mother and I had set up for him in 1992, and the house in Stowe and the brokerage account I'd been feeding for half a century, and the small but extremely valuable collection of mid-century American art my wife had assembled before her death. Pieces that, if you knew the market, you knew were worth more than the house itself. What Caleb had was the only son of a federal judge with no other heirs. I sat with that information for 2 days. I didn't tell him. I'm telling you that part because I know how it sounds. I know there are people who will say I should have gone straight to my son and laid it out and let him decide. But I have watched, in courtrooms and out of them, what happens when you tell a man in love that the woman he loves is a liar. He doesn't believe you. He believes her, and then he resents you, and the woman knows you've made your move, and she goes underground and gets cleverer, and by the time the truth surfaces on its own, you're not the father anymore. You're the enemy his wife warned him about. So I sat with it. I sat with it through Thanksgiving, when she came up to the house again and helped my sister-in-law in the kitchen and asked me, with what looked like real curiosity, about a 1962 D. Benkhorn study hanging above the dining room buffet. She knew exactly what it was. I could tell from the way her eyes flicked to the lower right corner where the signature was, and from the half-second pause before she pretended not to know. I sat with it through Christmas, when Caleb pulled me aside in my study after everyone else had gone to bed, and told me he was going to propose on New Year's Eve. He said, "I know you have reservations, Dad. I can feel it. You haven't said anything, but I can feel it." I looked at him. My boy, same brown eyes as his mother, same nervous habit of pressing his thumb into his palm when he was bracing for something hard. I said, "Tell me what you love about her." He thought for a long time, longer than I expected. Then he said, "She makes me feel like I'm not invisible." And that, more than anything Felicia had told me, was what told me I was going to lose him if I tried to fight her head on. Because that's the kind of thing you say about someone who has identified your wound and pressed her thumb into it on purpose. I said, "Then I'll be at the proposal." He hugged me. He cried a little. He told me he loved me. I told him I loved him too, and I meant it, and I thought, I am going to have to be very careful and very patient and very quiet, and I am going to have to let her think I am exactly the man she wants me to be. Which, for the next 8 months, is what I did. I called her sweetheart. I let her decorate the guest room she stayed in when they came up for weekends. I sent her flowers on her birthday with a card that said, "Welcome to the family." I deferred to her on wedding planning. I wrote a check for the venue, a coastal estate in Newport that cost more than my first house, without blinking. I let her think I was a sentimental old widower whose only remaining purpose was to bankroll his son's happiness, and then die quietly in a house full of expensive paintings she would inherit through Caleb in due course. She relaxed around me. That's the part I want you to understand. She relaxed. She started leaving her phone on the kitchen counter when she went to the bathroom. She started talking about wedding details on speakerphone in my living room with a tone of voice she'd never used in front of me before. Clipped, businesslike, a little impatient. She started in small ways, treating me like furniture. That was what I wanted. Furniture sees everything. What I want to tell you next is the part I've thought about the most in the months since, because I knew by April what she was doing. Felicia had pulled records. Renata had quietly inquired with 3 different elder law attorneys in Boston about the mechanics of guardianship proceedings for parents with early cognitive decline. She had reached out to a placement consultant for memory care facilities in Western Massachusetts. She had, and this is the part that made me put down the phone and walk outside and stand in my driveway in the rain for 10 minutes, opened a new email account using a variation of my name and use it to subscribe to 2 newsletters about Alzheimer's research, which is the kind of thing you do when you're building a paper trail to suggest someone has been worried about himself for a long time. She was planning to have me declared incompetent within 2 years of the wedding. Caleb, as my son and her husband, would be the obvious guardian. From there, the trust, the house, the art, the brokerage, all of it would root through him, and from him through their joint accounts, and eventually, after some appropriate interval, through whatever exit she had already planned for herself. I knew this in April. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in September. I did not tell Caleb. I did not tell my sister. I did not tell anyone except Felicia and one other person, an old friend from the bench named Hollis, retired now, who had spent the last 15 years of her career on the bankruptcy side, and who knew more about how money disappears than anyone I've ever met. I told Hollis everything, and asked her to help me design what came next. And she said, "Are you sure you don't want to just stop the wedding?" I said. If I stop the wedding, she walks. She finds another mark, and my son spends the next 5 years thinking I ruined his life. Hala said, You want her to ruin it herself. I said, I want him to see it, with his own eyes, in front of everyone, so that when he looks back 20 years from now, he doesn't remember it as something I did to him. He remembers it as something she did, and I was the one standing next to him when he saw it. Hollis was quiet for a while. Then she said, All right, let's build it. I'm going to skip over the technical parts of what we built, because the technical parts are not what the story is about. I will tell you only that it involved a financial consultant Renata had been quietly using, who turned out to be willing, under certain pressures applied by Felicia, to wear a wire. It involved the contract review I commissioned of the prenuptial agreement Renata had presented to Caleb in May, which she had written herself, and which contained 3 clauses that would have been laughed out of any courtroom in New England, but which Caleb, trusting her, had nearly signed without independent counsel. It involved my quietly retaining a forensic accountant to mirror every account I owned, in case she made a move before the wedding. It involved a conversation with a producer at a Boston television station whom I had known for 30 years, and who agreed, for reasons I won't go into, to have a single, discreet camera operator present at the reception under the cover of being part of the wedding videography team. What it mostly involved was waiting. The week of the wedding, she came up to the house alone on Wednesday. Caleb was in Boston finishing up her project. She wanted, she said, to spend some time with me before things got chaotic. I poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat on the back porch and watched the light go down on the mountains. She said, You've been so good to me. I want you to know I see it. I said, Of course. You're family now. She said, Caleb is lucky to have a father who's still so sharp at your age. I looked at her. I let my face do something I had been practicing for months. A slight, watery smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes, the kind a man wears when he's trying to cover the fact that he forgot what someone just said to him. I said, I have my days. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than a kind person would have. Then she put her hand on mine and said, We all do. I went to bed that night, and I did not sleep. I lay in the dark, and I thought about my wife. I thought about the morning she died, 6 years ago, in a hospital room in Burlington, and the last thing she said to me, which was, Take care of him, and I thought, I am taking care of him. Even if he hates me for it tomorrow. The wedding was on a Saturday. Newport. The estate sat on a bluff over the water, and the ceremony was outside. White chairs in rows, ocean wind pulling at the edge of the canopy. I walked Caleb partway down the aisle the way his mother would have, and I kissed him on the temple, and I sat down in the front row, and I watched my son marry a woman I knew was a thief. I want to tell you that I felt something dramatic in that moment. I didn't. What I felt was a kind of cold, professional patience, the same thing I used to feel in chambers right before walking out to deliver a verdict in a long trial. There was work still to do. The work was almost done. The reception was in a tent on the lawn. 230 guests, my son's college friends, his colleagues, Renata's mother and a small handful of her cousins, my sister and her family, 3 of my former clerks, 2 senators, 1 Supreme Judicial Court justice, and the regional president of the hospital system Renata worked for, whom I had personally requested be invited and seated near the head table. There was a string quartet, there was champagne, there was a 5-course menu. Renata had chosen everything. Toasts were after the entree. The best man went first. Renata's maid of honor, a coworker I'd never met, went second. Then the father of the bride toast, except there was no father of the bride. Renata's father had died when she was 12, or so she had told us, so the spot defaulted to me. I stood up. I walked to the small stage where the quartet had been playing. I took the microphone from the band leader. I looked out at the room. I said, When my wife died, I made her a promise that I would take care of our son. I have tried for 6 years to keep that promise. Tonight, in front of all of you, I am keeping it again. The room was warm. People smiled the way people smile at the beginning of a long, sentimental toast. I said, "Caleb, I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world. Your mother loved you the same way, and what I am about to do, I am doing because I love you, and because you deserve the truth, and because the people in this room deserve to know what kind of woman they have just watched you marry." The room changed temperature. I felt it more than I saw it. Renata, at the head table, set down her glass. I said, 2 years ago, a man in Providence paid the woman now sitting at the head of this table $204,000 to walk away from an engagement after she had quietly opened 7 lines of credit in his name. 18 months ago, a cardiologist in Hartford paid her $310,000 to do the same. There are non-disclosure agreements on file in both cases. I have copies of both. I have, additionally, recordings made within the last 6 weeks, with the cooperation of the financial consultant she has been working with since February, in which she discusses, by name and by dollar amount, her plan to have me declared mentally incompetent within 24 months of tonight, transfer my estate through my son into a joint account, and exit the marriage within 5 years with the settlement she has already drafted. Someone at table 11 dropped a fork. I heard it land. I said, "I have these recordings on a thumb drive in my jacket pocket. I have provided copies to the regional president of her employer, who is sitting at table 3, because the recordings also contain references to billing irregularities at her hospital that I am told constitute federal wire fraud. I am told the relevant U.S. STAC attorney's office was contacted on Thursday. I looked at my son. He was staring at me. His mouth was open a little. His thumb was pressed into his palm. I said, 'Caleb, I am so sorry. I am so sorry, son. I tried to find a gentler way and I could not find one. I love you. I am so sorry.' And then my son did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He stood up. He walked, slowly, around the head table. He passed Renata without looking at her. He came up onto the small stage. He took the microphone out of my hand, and he said into it, with his voice shaking but level, 'I knew.' The room went absolutely still. He said, 'Dad, I knew. I've known for 3 weeks. I found one of the agreements in her bag in May, and I didn't believe it, and I called your friend Felicia in July because you'd mentioned her once, and I didn't know who else to call, and Felicia told me everything, and she told me you were already handling it, and she told me to let you handle it, and she told me you needed me to look like I didn't know.' I could not breathe. He said, 'I'm sorry I didn't tell you I knew. I didn't want you to call it off. I wanted everyone to see her the way you saw her, the way I finally saw her.' He turned to the room. He said, 'I'd like you all to stay and finish your dinner. The bar is still open. The cake is paid for. My father and I are going home.' He set the microphone down. He walked off the stage, and he held out his hand to me, and I took it, and we walked together past the head table where Renata was sitting very still with both hands flat on the white tablecloth. And we walked out of the tent, and we walked across the lawn in the September wind, and we got into the car, and neither of us said anything for the entire 2-hour drive back to Boston. When we pulled into the parking garage under his building, he turned the engine off, and he sat there for a long time. He said, 'I kept thinking she was going to tell me. I kept giving her chances, even today, even walking down the aisle. I kept thinking, if she tells me right now, I'll forgive her, I'll figure it out. She didn't tell me.' I said, 'I know, son.' He said, 'How did you know?' 'In October. You knew right away.' 'How?' I thought about it. I said, 'She touched things she didn't own.' He looked at me. He started to laugh. And then he started to cry. And then he put his head down on the steering wheel, and he sobbed the way he hadn't sobbed since the morning his mother died. And I sat in a passenger seat of my son's car in a parking garage in Boston at midnight on the day of his wedding, and I put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I used to when he was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms, and I let him cry. When he was done, he sat up and wiped his face on his sleeve. He said, 'Mom would have known too.' I said, 'Mom would have known faster.' He laughed again. A real laugh this time. Small. He said, "Dad, thank you for waiting, for letting me see it." I said, "Caleb, thank you for waiting, for letting me see it." I said, "Caleb, you don't ever have to thank me for that. Not ever." The legal aftermath took 11 months. The U.S. Attorney's Office did, in fact, indict Renata on 7 counts of wire fraud related to the billing scheme at her hospital, and 3 counts of identity theft related to credit lines she had opened in Caleb's name in June, which we hadn't known about until forensic accounting found them in October. The previous fiancés came forward once the indictment was public. Both NDAs were voided on grounds of fraud in the inducement. Renata pled out the summer after the wedding to avoid trial and was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. She is currently serving that sentence in Danbury. Caleb has not visited her and does not intend to. The marriage was annulled 4 weeks after the wedding. I paid for the annulment. Caleb moved out of the South End condo in November. He moved up to Stowe for a while, lived in the guest room, helped me clean out my wife's old studio above the garage. We didn't talk about Renata much. We talked about his mother a lot. We talked about my father, whom I had never told him much about, and I told him the story of the second time my father said he was proud of me, which was the day Caleb was born. He went back to Boston in February. He's seeing someone now, a woman named Priya, who is a pediatric oncologist at Mass General, and she has met me twice, and I will tell you only that she does not touch things in my house that don't belong to her. She asked me, the first time she came up, whether she could look at the Diebenkorn more closely because she had written a paper on Diebenkorn in college, and she stood in front of it for almost 5 minutes with her hands clasped behind her back, and then she turned to me and said, "I can see why your wife loved this one." I poured her a glass of wine. I am 73 years old. I have been a son and a husband and a father and a judge and a widower, and I have learned exactly one thing in all those roles that I am sure of, which is this: you cannot save the people you love by telling them what to see. You can only stand next to them long enough and quietly enough that when the moment comes, they see it themselves. And then you take their hand. And you walk them home. That's what I did for my boy. That's all I did. I stood next to him and I waited, and when he saw it, I took his hand and I walked him home. And every time I think about that night, the wind off the water, the white tent on the lawn, my son setting down that microphone and reaching for me, I thank God I waited. I thank God I didn't speak in October. I thank God I let him see her with his own eyes. Because the man who walked off that stage with me wasn't a son being rescued by his father. He was a man, my son, choosing on his own, in front of everyone, what kind of life he was going to have. That's the only kind of saving that lasts. I've lived long enough now to know that nothing in this life arrives by accident. Every door that opens, every door that closes, every face that walks into our living room and runs its fingers along furniture that does not belong to it. All of it is the slow, exact result of choices made long before the moment arrives. Renata did not appear in my son's life by chance. She appeared because she had spent years sharpening herself into a particular kind of weapon, and Caleb appeared in her path because he carried, in plain view, a wound she had learned how to find. The cause was her hunger. The effect was the morning she walked into my house and started measuring the candlesticks. None of that was random. None of it ever is. What I want my son to carry from that night, and what I want anyone listening to carry from this story, is something I had to learn the slow way and pay full price for. Goodness alone does not protect the people we love. A kind heart by itself is a door without a lock. Caleb was kind. His kindness was not the problem. The problem was that kindness had not yet been joined to the harder thing, which is the willingness to look directly at what frightens you and not look away. That is what I would call wisdom. And wisdom is not something you are born with. You earn it. You earn it by being wrong and by being lied to, and by sitting at a dinner table watching someone you do not trust laugh at the right moments, and by choosing, even then, to keep your eyes open. The third thing, The thing that held me together through 11 months of waiting was something my own father, in his quiet New Hampshire way, called keeping your feet under you. He meant endurance. He meant the discipline to do the right thing slowly when doing it quickly would feel better. I wanted to confront Renata in October. I wanted to throw her out of my house in November. Every day of those 11 months, I wanted to. And every day I did not. Because I understood that my son needed to see her with his own eyes, not be told about her with mine. Patience like that is not glamorous. It is lonely. But it is the only kind of strength that actually saves anyone. Caleb is doing well now. He is whole. He chose his life back in front of 230 witnesses, and that choice belongs to him forever. No one can take it from him because no one gave it to him. He earned it the same way I earned the patience to stand next to him while he did. Cause and effect. The work you do quietly, for years, in the dark of your own conscience, is the only inheritance that matters in the end. Everything else can be taken. That cannot.